The Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Glory to you, O Lord. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. And then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." And while he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome with fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself, alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The Gospel of the Lord. Pray with me. Holy God, once again we place our lives in front of your open word, asking that your Spirit would also open our hearts to hear it, so that we might be transformed by it closer into the image of Jesus, the Word made flesh. Matthew begins this story with 3 pregnant words. 6 days later. Mark starts his gospel with the same 3 words. 6 days later than what? Well, 6 days before our gospel story today, Jesus and his disciples had been in Caesarea Philippi, a city that's about 25 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. He had asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter said, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus had 2 responses to Peter's answer. First, he told the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. And secondly, he told them for the first time his most disturbing teaching of all, that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the 3rd day be raised. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. I suspect Peter said something like, "Jesus, that's nuts. That will never happen to you." But Matthew's gospel, he was writing the Bible, and so he didn't write it quite like that. He wrote, "God forbid it, Lord, this must never happen to you." Well, whatever Peter said, Jesus was not pleased. He said, "Get behind me, Satan. You're looking at this from man's perspective and not from God's." 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain. It was probably Mount Hermon, which is only 5 miles or so north of Caesarea Philippi. And he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun. The Greek says it was otherworldly. And his clothes became dazzling white. This story has many parallels with Moses, who went up Mount Sinai with his 3 companions, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, to get the 10 Commandments, and as Moses talked to God, the skin of his face shone. Jesus' dazzling bright clothes remind us of Psalm 104, verse 2. "You are full of might and majesty, God. You are clothed with light, like a garment." And suddenly, Moses and Elijah appeared, according to Luke's gospel, appeared in glory like angels, and they were talking with Jesus. The phrase Moses and Elijah is equivalent to the law and the prophets. Moses, having brought God's laws from Mount Sinai down to the people, and Elijah, the prophet who, according to Malachi chapter 4, would return before the Messiah to signal that the end of time was imminent. Luke's gospel says Moses and Elijah were talking with Jesus about his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. The Greek word translated as departure is actually exodus. In Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension, he was leading people, Jews, Gentiles, all people, out of bondage to sin and death, and delivering them, like Moses, into new life. They were speaking about his exodus, which he was about to not accomplish. A better translation is to fulfill in Jerusalem. Fulfill, indicating that his death, resurrection, and ascension were not accidental, unanticipated events, but fulfilled the prophecies of Moses and Elijah and the other prophets. And then Peter, never at a loss for words, blurts out, "Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you'd like, I'll make 3 dwellings here, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah." Peter knew that he was seeing God's glory in Jesus, but what he did not see was a tent of meeting, like the tent where Moses met with God during the wilderness years. And so Peter offers to set one up, one for each of the 3 great ones shining in glory before him. And while Peter was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, as it had overshadowed Moses on Mount Sinai. And from the cloud, a voice said, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." The voice did not say, "Listen to me." It said, "Listen to him." But Jesus was not saying anything. He's just standing there shining. Listen to him. God probably meant, listen to what Jesus tells you about the coming journey to Jerusalem. And when the disciples heard the voice from the cloud, they fell to the ground terrified. If they had known what awaited them up on that mountain, they would probably have done what the Israelites did with Moses. They would have said, "Jesus, we'll wait down here. You go on up, and when you come back, tell us what you saw and what you experienced, and we'll be interested." But Jesus had taken them up with him because they needed to hear directly from God that the Jesus they had been following for the past 3 years was no less than the beloved Son of God, God's self shining in human form, so that they could be strengthened when their faith was put to the ultimate test at Jesus' crucifixion and death a few weeks later. They lay on the ground overcome with fear. Moses and Elijah disappear. And what does Jesus do? He reaches down and touches them. He doesn't rebuke them. And he said, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one but Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man," his term for himself, "has been raised from the dead." What do we do with this story? First, we do what God told the disciples to do. We listen to Jesus. He said that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering and be killed. Theologians have argued for centuries about why he had to go, had to suffer, and had to be killed. The only way I can understand it is that it was the only way for him to overcome death, so that we might live again with him after death. And most importantly, we listen to him say, and on the third day be raised. Those last 7 words, and on the third day be raised, are the foundation of our faith, the foundation on which the entire Christian religion is founded, Jesus' resurrection. And then we do what the disciples did. We come down the mountain with Jesus, and there at the foot of the mountain are people who need help. God said, listen to Jesus, and Jesus says he will give us his Spirit to help us do the other things he said, like give yourself in sacrificial ways, like the Good Samaritan did. Forgive those who hurt you, as the Father forgave his prodigal son. To listen to Jesus means to hear him and then to follow him, giving ourselves to those in need, whatever their need, as he did and as his Spirit helps us to do also. Amen.